Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, the second part thereof for the 3rd of October 2025. We're going to start off with something I talked about in this morning's hits and losses video. Just repeat a couple of bits and then add to it. So first of all, Russian satellites have been stalking British military satellites up in space, according to the head of UK Space Command. In an interview with the BBC, Major General Paul Tedman has for the first time set out the level of interference from Moscow against the UK space-based assets. He said Russia had also been trying to jam the US military satellites with ground-based systems every week. Last month, Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said Russia had been shadowing satellites used by their military. Okay, so the first three elements of what I'm going to talk about are going to be to do with how we are at war with Russia. And this is a narrative you're starting to see more overtly in the political spaces, and the information space in general, sort of media and politicians and, analysts. And correctly so. I said this, as I said this morning, over a year ago, when I gave a talk on this to Stockbridge in Hampshire, where I said, my whole thesis was we are involved in World War III. It's just that most of you don't realise this, but we are involved in World War III. Russia is at war with us. We don't necessarily admit that we're at war with Russia, but we are. We're giving all assistance to Ukraine that we can, bar frontline troops. We're actually giving troops and special forces are helping in Ukraine, unbeknownst to many. We've got military aid, political aid, financial aid, satellite and intelligence aid, espionage aid, so on and so forth. Everything that, for example, the UK, every domain that we can help Ukraine, we are helping in. Okay, but we're just not putting troops on the very front line. Well, okay, and at the same time, Russia is attacking us. Hybrid warfare, that cyber warfare, information warfare, that can have tangible outcomes like attacking hospitals, that can have a mortality rate associated with them. Now, I use the UK as an example there, but we can really apply this to most European countries. We are at war with Russia and we just don't realise it, or our public don't understand this enough. And I think it's the duty now of our politicians and analysts to communicate this to the public. We are being attacked in space by Russia. And then, you can throw on some other elements to this. So Germany in the first quarter of this year alone, according to Die Welt, we had over 530 overflights attributed to Russia over German critical infrastructure, power plants, hospitals, military facilities, and that it's been kept quiet so as not to alarm the population. My point this morning was that we should alarm the population. The population should be alarmed, otherwise they're not going to understand why we're sending money and assistance to Ukraine on a consistent basis. If they don't understand that we're at war with Russia, then they're going to be questioning why we are helping Ukraine so much. What's the importance? Well, actually, their security is our security, and we are indeed involved with Russia as it stands. Even if it's not like a wholly kinetic sense at the moment, although we are providing kinetic warfare assistance to Ukraine. So even worse, the Bundeswehr, the German army, is currently not authorized to shoot down such drones due to a lack of appropriate systems and a legal framework. But perhaps Merz only learned yesterday how important drone defense is. So Germany, okay, there have been drones sighted, as you can see here, 530 drone overflights attributed to Russia. You had drones last night flying from Belgium into Russia. We had 15 drones over a Belgian facility. We've got Denmark, Norway, the other Nordic and Baltic nations, and Poland experiencing what Russia is doing. And then we have the Germans investigating a ship that has supposedly been releasing drones, and the French investigating a ship likewise. So that's what we already knew, and I'm reiterating what I said this morning. Then you can add this. Denmark's military intelligence reports that Russian naval forces have aimed weapons at Danish warships and helicopters, disrupted navigation systems in key maritime straits, and even sailed collision courses, all of which are clear provocations. So that looks like a Reuters piece. Denmark reports repeated Russian naval provocations in its straits. Russian is provoking, antagonizing, and is essentially at war with us. And we need to react with that in mind. Now, Putin made some statements at Valdai yesterday in Sochi where he was pretty overt in blaming NATO and the EU and the West for the war in Ukraine, obviously. He said the system they wanted to expel us from simply refuses to let Russia go because it needs Russia as a vital part of the overall balance. Without Russia, the global balance cannot be built, neither economic nor strategic nor cultural nor logistical. Nothing. Now, this is a conversation I had, I think, years ago, that Russia thinks it's more important than it really is. It thinks it's more involved in global affairs than it really is. Russia's fairly irrelevant, with all due respect, which is precisely none. Russia, since 2014, has been more and more isolated, and for good reason. And no one's missing it. Like, Russia isn't that much of an important player. Yes, we can talk about hydrocarbons, and that's about it. Outside of hydrocarbons, meh. Hydrocarbons and let's say grain. You know, there's a lot of food coming out of one of the breadbaskets of the world there. But realistically, you know, Russia is not as important as it thinks it is. But perhaps that explains an awful lot of Russian cultural psyche, where they're like, how dare you not blah, blah, blah. You know, Russian tourists are quite, you know, thinking they're much more important than they really are, is my sense anyway. Putin blamed NATO for not wanting to make Russia its member in 1954 and 2000 and having geopolitical and historical stereotypes about Russia. Russia has announced its readiness to join NATO twice. The first time was in 1954 in the USSR times. The second time was during the visit of Clinton in Moscow in 2000. But, you know, yeah, he's going to use these opportunities as attempts to badmouth NATO and the EU and blame everyone else on the war in Ukraine apart from himself. Now, he did also, and I mentioned this in this morning's video, talk about how if Tomahawks were given, cruise missiles from the Americans were given to Ukraine, then, hey, we'll deal with that. It's not a problem. Yada, yada, yada. Which I thought was fascinating because he didn't saber rattle the nuclear weapons, the Russian nuclear weapons. And so that is a bit of a meh answer to Tomahawks, which, in my opinion, is actually huge. That is to say that they're not actually red lines. They're not red lines because we're the ones that often build up these red lines. And we say, oh, I can't cross that. Why? They didn't say so. We're the ones that said we shouldn't cross that red line. So I interpret that as implicit permission for allies to give huge numbers of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles to Ukraine and let them go for it. Now, the analyst translated some of the Q&A. So it's like it's not even happening. Putin calmly dismisses almost everything. The analyst says, in one of his rare and therefore all the more significant public TV prepared Q&A sessions, Putin calmly made it seem that everything is perfectly okay and there's really nothing to worry about, except the fact it was necessary in the first place tells you that things are not okay. That's a good point. The government is worried. Fuel prices and the availability crises is deeply impactful and it's reaching almost everyone. As a sidebar to this, the Department of Energy have finally come out and made a cautious statement about fuel issues in Russia, which is like the first, I think, really big public announcement, which I think shows you that they are actually really quite worried. Anyway, analyst continues, yet nobody can bring themselves to admit what's really happening and that Ukraine is doing the damage. The state is doubling its propaganda budget. The need to blanket Russia with lies lies so deep and so thick that they alter the perception of reality is so deeply ingrained. The idea of being truthful and using that truth to galvanize unity is beyond them. Even Goebbels saw that hard truth was more effective when lightly dressed up and made to work for the state than swamping everyone with increasingly sophisticated but ultimately transparent lies. The 1943 Total War speech was a landmark. Russia has chosen the alternate universe. Putin's batting off of questions such as what happens if Ukraine is given Tomahawks was brushed off with a, well, they won't make any difference on a battlefield, but they will damage relations with the US. And that's my point, that he's not saying, well, if they do that, then there'll be hell to pay and we'll get out the nukes. He didn't say that. That was Putin's answer. No, they would not change the battlefield, but they would seriously damage the economy and the production. But just an hour or so later, the rumour mill in Washington was making it clear they were very unlikely to happen, and unlikely means never. Alternatives were being considered. To be fair, I never expected them. Too many demands on production, which is maxed out for years, supplying the Air Force, Navy, Army, and foreign buyers like Japan and the UK. Meanwhile, Putin carries on looking like it was just another day. He barely got back to his bunker when a massive weapons factory exploded 1,600 kilometers from the front, and another major refinery was on fire from a swarm attack. Meanwhile, the central bank are performing handstands using the same money twice over, printing money. It then gets the banks to lend back to it is supposedly sound economics. So basically, they printed a load of money and they have bought government bonds with that money. The lies about inflation, official figures are about a quarter of reality, keep being fed with no data to back them up. The front lines are nearly static. The MOD is been caught out lying publicly over land it faked in Kupiansk. It faked taking in Kupiansk as losses there pile up in a desperate attempt to hide their embarrassment. The physical damage to Russia grows every day, but it's all okay. Russia's still winning in the fundamental war of its time. You'd be forgiven for wondering how. I think there are challenges for, and by the way, after that Valdai visit, that Sochi visit, literally half an hour after I think he finished speaking, 40 minutes, it was hit with drones. This is something we're only just finding out, that the Ukrainians actually hit Sochi with drones, and that led to a whole bunch of plane delays. But anyway, more on that tomorrow. I do think Russia are hurting Ukraine at the moment, I have to say. Ukraine had the biggest attack on its gas infrastructure take place last night, particularly in Poltava. It is hurting. I think a CHPP, as a combined heat and power plant in Kramatorsk area, has been hit today, and there's no electricity there. It is tough. The Russians will have no compunction hitting civilian infrastructure. They took out a farm last night with 20 drones on a farm, killing 13,000 pigs. So I think Russia is going to start getting pretty dirty ahead of the winter period, and they are going to stop Ukraine providing electricity, energy for their industry, for their commerce, and for their civilians. Now, President Macron's statements during a meeting of the European political community, which took place over a couple of days of this week. We are at a moment where Russia is not clearly getting its main objectives. It's not a 3-week special operation. They didn't get Kyiv. They didn't change the regime. On top of it, 2 great friends joined NATO, which is a big strategic defeat for Russia. Now, the question is how not just to sustain the war efforts, but clearly change the dynamic and help Ukraine in this context. No, Russia is not winning. No, Ukraine is not losing this war. That's a statement he said a number of times. And I broadly agree. Russia isn't winning. Ukraine isn't losing. Russia's not winning doesn't mean that Ukraine's winning. It's not quite a zero-sum game. It's actually, both sides can lose this. Who's going to lose it? Both sides are going to lose this. They have lost oodles of people, oodles of money, oodles of resources. Both sides will lose this. The question is, who will lose the worst? And who do we help to make sure that the right people get the most beneficial outcome here, and the wrong uns get the worst outcome? Collectively, this is going back to Macron. Collectively, we managed to re-engage with the US, and the statements of the US president last week are a huge change if you compare them with the ones in the Oval Office a few months ago. It's very important because it's a concrete case of countering the misinformation spread by Russia. Now the key points for all of us are to step up in terms of support for Ukraine, which is one of the best ways for Ukraine to change the situation and recover some territories. Another point, long-range missiles. Yes, it's all about long-range missiles now. That's my opinion. Long-range drones and missiles. Ukraine needs an absolute ton of them. Now, Viktor Orban in the EU meeting was causing quite a bit of ruckus. There's a bit of a tete-a-tete with Friedrich Merz from Germany. Orban has said Hungary doesn't want to be in NATO or the EU if Ukraine joins. I mean, you can't say it more obviously than that. So this Ukrainian source, Divana Ukraine, says, at the EU summit in Copenhagen, Copenhagen, Viktor Orban openly declared that Hungary does not want to belong to any alliance, not NATO, not the EU, if Ukraine becomes a member. In plain words, Hungary refuses to share a table with the Ukrainians, even inside the very structures that guarantee its own security and prosperity. So maybe the solution is simple. If Orban doesn't want to be in the EU or NATO with Ukraine, then perhaps Europe should ask whether it wants to be in an alliance with him. His statements have crossed from mere obstructionism into full-blown Ukrainophobia rhetoric that now mirrors Moscow's, not Brussels. And history is repeating here. Hungary once aligned itself with Hitler's Reich, but betraying its neighbours and its own future. Today, Orban seems intent on repeating that path, standing with Putin instead of Europe, isolating his country while pretending it is neutral. Ukraine, meanwhile, is bleeding and fighting for the very values NATO and the EU are founded to protect. For Orban to suggest that Hungarians don't want to stand alongside Ukrainians is not only cowardice, it's treason of the idea of a united Europe. Treason to the idea. The real question now is no longer whether Ukraine belongs in NATO and the EU. It does. The question is whether Hungary, under Orban, still belongs there. Something to worry about is the Czech election due to take place in the coming days. This is looking bad, although I was listening to Alistair Campbell, maybe hopefully saying they might have looked at Moldova and seen that actually we don't want Russian influence and we do want to be on the side of a Western-looking government, maybe. I mean, I think it's unlikely. I think Czechia is looking very much to elect Babis, former, I think, Prime Minister, and from what I understand, what Alistair Campbell was saying is that it's quite like Keir Starmer in the UK, where, you know, fairly solid, like policy, if you like, but the communication aspect has been dearly missing from Petr Fiala and the establishment in who are governing at the moment. And now you're going to get populists taking over, right-wing populists, Babis of the ANO, who are going to be not supporting Ukraine and far more likely to support Russia. And then you're going to have this problem of maybe Slovakia, Hungary, and now Czechia providing an even bigger obstruction to EU unity and support for Ukraine. And it's definitely a problem going forward. Now, staying on Hungary, though, Hungary doesn't want to be in the EU with Ukraine because its destiny is to be close to Russia. Quote, Ukraine is a country with a very difficult fate. Why should we share this difficult fate? So, thank you, Orban. Now, Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, decided to finish off Orban today in Copenhagen. Quote, Viktor Orban believes there is no war. I believe there is a war. And the question is, whose side are you on in this war? We know whose side Poland is on. We know whose side NATO and Europe are on. And unfortunately, we probably also know whose side Viktor Orban is on. Ouch. That's going to hurt. And then there was another interaction. Orban, we all spend more on armaments than Russia. So why are we afraid? Why are we stronger than... We are stronger than them. Tusk tugging Orban by the sleeve. I love it when he uses my arguments. Ouch. Yeah. You know, we are stronger than Russia. Russia isn't the big, strong bear that people think it is. Now, Savchenko Volodymyr here says the European Commission, well, referring to Politico, the European Commission has rejected Hungary's request for the release of 550 million euros. Now, the EU has withheld a bunch of funding to Hungary because they've been democratically backsliding. Brussels will only allocate 163.5 million in advance payments as discontent with Orban grows. Even this money could be returned to the EC if it is deemed misused. At the informal summit in Copenhagen, leaders are discussing a shift from unanimous voting to qualified majority decision making to override Orban's vote. I would love to hear more about that, and I do hope that they've made some progress on sidestepping the issues of Hungarian obstructionism. Now, the finance ministers of the group of seven said that they were, so the G7, seven biggest sort of economies in the world, said that they would act together to increase pressure on Russia. Good news. Those who continue to increase purchases of Russian oil and those who help circumvent restrictions will be targeted. That's a report from Reuters. Ursula von der Leyen has said the European Commission proposes tougher sanctions against Russia. Quote, we are no longer approaching sanctions gradually. but are proposing much tougher measures on energy, financial services and trade. The 19th package is currently under consideration. So it still hasn't really got filtered right through that 19th package. Claim is that it's going to be a lot stronger when it properly materializes, although I had thought it had all been sorted out. Andres Sabihar has announced that Nicaragua is not in Ukraine's good books, and Ukraine has officially severed diplomatic relations. He said Ukraine has officially severed diplomatic relations with the Republic of Nicaragua. The decision comes in response to Nicaragua's recognition of Russia's so-called sovereignty over temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson regions and Crimea. We consider the decision as a deliberate attempt to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, a gross violation of Ukraine's constitution, the UN Charter and fundamental norms and principles of the international law. By aligning itself politically with the aggressor state seeking to legitimize a violent seizure of Ukrainian land and opening the so-called honorary consulate in Russian-occupied Crimea, Nicaragua has become an accomplice to Russia's crime of aggression against Ukraine. Wow, so Nicaragua have opened a consulate in Crimea of all places. Absolute kick in the teeth, that one. Now, Kazakhstan has begun large-scale inspections of Russian cargo from China. Carriers see this as a sign of a change in Kazakhstan's policy towards stricter compliance with Western sanctions. Customs inspections are carried out in a 99% of cases for these categories. Queues at the border began to build up since mid-September, mostly with trucks carrying dual-use goods and products under sanctions, electronics, drones, parts for them, and goods of Western brands. Wow. Kazakhstan could end up being an incredibly important player here in the outcome of the war, in terms of stopping Russia from getting some dubious goods through Kazakhstan and into Russian borders. I'm sure China will find a further loophole in another neighbouring country rather than let that continue. But I reported the other day that there were huge queues of Russian trucks at the Kazakhstan border. The Kazakh border. Derek Tinas here reports that the president of Romania has presented European leaders with a report from Romania's Secret Service. Secret Services detailing Russia's interference in the country's 2024 presidential elections. Remember when Călin Georgescu was looking odds-on favourite, and then he was banned from running because of his influence from Russia and the fact he hadn't declared where his funding had come from, and then they ran it again and Nicolae Dan pipped through. Quote, "We were caught off guard. Romania could not have imagined that an attack of this size and magnitude would take place. We have learned from what has happened, and this will not happen here again. Moldova knew what to expect, and as a result of that, was better prepared to deal with it." Now, that's a pretty revealing statement then from Nicolae Dan, who says, you know, if Moldova hadn't been, you know, ears up, eyes open, and understanding what had happened in Romania, so that if Moldova hadn't known what to expect, then they could have been in trouble at that election. So good news. I presume Romania helped them out there. Now, Pekka Kaliuniemi here says, well, let's go back to the original quote here from September the 30th. Serbian police have arrested 11 people for Islamophobic and anti-Semitic attacks in France. So that's attacks on kind of both sides of that particular coin, designed to convince French Muslims and French Jews to blame each other and to exacerbate ethnic tensions inside France. They allegedly acted on behalf of Russia, says the Times of Israel. Now, if you go back, and we did know this, that I'd heard Bulgarians were responsible for this, but maybe there are other examples. If you remember, in France, there were people spray painting the Cross of David, the Jewish symbol there, and Star of David, sorry, not Cross of David, Star of David, the Jewish symbol, and that was being spray painted in, I presume in like Muslim dominant neighborhoods, and it was all, they're trying to stir up trouble, and it's like, who's doing this? And it's like both sides were being stirred up, and that's exactly how Russia operates, which is they don't really have an ideology in Europe that they particularly want. Same with the United States. It's like, which side would benefit us if they were in control? Okay, so we want to get them elected, so let's cause division, foment loads of discord, and then it's usually going to be some populist party that we want to be in charge. We need to sow enough division by firing up both sides here, that actually the populace that we want gets in because everyone's like really angry about all this stuff. But actually, we've been the ones that have been, winding up both, in this case, the Jews and the Muslims in France. So Pekka Kaliniemi says, this is what I've been trying to tell people for years. Much of the anti-Semitic and anti-Islam online rhetoric and public campaigns actually originate from Russia. The Russian disinformation campaign Doppelganger focused heavily on this after the Hamas terrorist attack on 7th of October 2023. And Russia-aligned groups are constantly recruiting and training people for these hybrid operations. Their goal is to divide European populations and pave the way for populist political movements. That's what I was saying. Movements that, not surprisingly, also happen to be pro-Kremlin. That is what they excel at, and they've been doing it for a long time. In fact, in 1959 and 1960, DDR and USSR agents travelled across Europe painting swastikas on walls. Wow, that's interesting there. And then, speaking of which, and actually there's a couple of things, I've got some UK stuff I don't know if I'm going to have time for. We'll start with this one. So, Right Honourable Will here says, breaking news, why isn't the UK media scrutinising Nigel Farage's links with Russia? So there's more here. Major donor to the Reform UK party sold parts used in weapons to Russian supplier. The aerospace company HR Smith Group was an early backer of the party after Nigel Farage became leader. Reform has faced criticism over comments seen as supporting Moscow. And I've shown you plenty of them from Farage himself. But actually, I'm going to go back to this, which we've already gone over. It's Nathan Gill, the leader of Reform UK Wales, but people still talking about that. You had articles in the New York Times, the Brussels Times, and German newspapers. Clive Wismar here says, funny, isn't it? It's a huge story. Concrete proof of Russian penetration in an influential right-wing European party with the obvious aim of destabilisation. It ought to be making banner headlines. It ought to lead to a thorough and extensive criminal investigation with raids, seizures, bank account freezes. But for some reason, this is not happening. Terry Christian, the story of the New York Times is running, but our dodgy UK press are avoiding. People still talking about this. Terry Christian here. This is I agree, a huge story. Odd it's getting so little coverage, far more of a threat to the UK security than asylum seekers and dinghies. And then Alistair Campbell himself says, the lack of media pressure on Farage and Tice and Yusuf and Anderson, all of these Reform UK leaders and movers and shakers, etc., to speak about the Nathan Gill Russian bribery scandal is mind-blowing. Like, no one is pressuring them big time. They should be absolutely hauled over the coals for this, and no one's doing enough. It is appalling. And then we find out the major donor to Reform UK party sold parts used in weapons to the Russian supplier. Incredible. Right. Moving on. So yesterday, a pro-Ukraine rally took place in Idlib, of all places, in Syria, opposing Syrian normalisation with Russia. Now, I don't know, it looks like a handful of people. I don't know, I can't see who this guy's speaking to, but I am surprised that Russia is even getting a look in Syria after all they've done over the years. Absolutely incredible. They should be persona non grata there and quite firmly kicked right out of Syria. Now, I wanted to do for ages, I've had this ready to do. I might do it now. It's quite short, actually. Timothy Milovanov reports on this story of a UK Conservative MP who lost his seat and then went to Ukraine to fight on the front line. What a story. The Times has done a piece on Jack Lepresti, 56, who lost his Conservative Member of Parliament seat in 2024 in the general election. And then Jack went to Ukraine, joined the International Legion, and now works in military intelligence, sourcing drones for frontline units and travelling to Donbass. He is the only ex-British MP fighting in Ukraine. Before politics, he served in the Royal Artillery Reserves, including a tour in Afghanistan. In Parliament, he chaired Conservative Friends of Ukraine and lobbied for weapons deliveries. His last common speech was also on Ukraine. After the Conservatives' 2024 defeat, when he lost his Filton and Bradley Stoke seat, he prepared to fight. He trained himself, improved his fitness, joined the Legion online, and by January 2025, Ukraine's defence intelligence gave him a hybrid role, procurement and combat. Lepresti now helps secure drones and counter-drone tech for Ukraine's front line. He also joins observation missions in the south and east, sometimes under fire. Quote, we're in a fast-moving arms race. Every week the technology changes, he says. UK law from 1870 still bans citizens from serving in foreign armies. Because of it, the British embassy in Kiev refuses to meet Lepresti or deal with him. He calls this nonsense and wants ministers to let veterans help Ukraine openly. Yeah, interesting. He misses his 4 children, but says he will stay in Ukraine as long as I can be useful. He rents a Kiev flat, studies Ukrainian, and says, quote, the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. I'm fighting for my children's future in a free Europe. Wow, that's brilliant. Good man. So that's a really good example to set. So well done to Jack Lepresti there. Not getting too disconsolate after losing an election and actually using that as a springboard to do something with tremendous meaning there. So good stuff. Okay, we're going to just do a couple of things from what's going on in the US, because otherwise I had to do separate videos. And so very quickly, just crazy stuff going on. I've already done videos on how the US is descending into fascism, and I've defined fascism and looked at it from a quite a kind of technical point of view. This is bad news. This is very bad news. The US government has stopped the funding of PubMed, the most comprehensive database of biomedical literature. I mean, PubMed is incredibly important. And now that's being defunded. My goodness, what an anti-scientific campaign the American administration is leading. Why would you do this, says this PhD chap. This database is literally a matter of life and death. Because of lapse in government funding, the information on this website may not be up to date, etc., etc. So PubMed, they're taking a hit. Update, billionaire Rob Citrone, whose hedge fund bet heavily on Argentina, pressed Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, his longtime friend and former colleague, to rescue the country, according to Argentine media. So we know that there's $20 billion taxpayer-funded bailout for Russia given by Bessent. People are wondering, what are you doing there? Because Argentina have soybean farmers that are providing soybeans to China because China aren't buying any from the US. So why are you bailing out an almost adversarial nation here? Well, they're not, because they love a bit of Javier Milei. But it's not just about loving him for his anarcho-capitalistic rip up the government approach to governance. It's because actually a bunch of their mateys have got money wrapped up in Argentina. So again, the US government, the US taxpayer-funded purse is being used to protect the interests of moneyed individuals that are friends of the government. This is just outright corruption. So CE Noticias Financieras, a wire service in Latin America, reported that after the bailout faced resistance with lower-level Trump officials, Citrone managed to connect with Bessent to get him to intervene directly. Ariel Maciel, political economy editor at Perfil, a large Argentine media outlet, said on an Argentine broadcast, Citrone is really the one who intervenes. He basically tells Bessent, hey, we need to help in Argentina. Popular Information contacted Citrone's hedge fund, Discovery Capital, and asked if these reports in Argentine media were accurate. Discovery Capital declined to comment. Another major issue is that as the Argentine economy was in a complete tailspin in early September, Citrone bought more bonds. Maciel reports the timing of Citrone's recent purchases has raised suspicions that Citrone has access to confidential information. That is not cool. And actually, we're now going to go back to the UK again here and talk about Javier Milei. And again, we can connect. Honestly, Reform UK is basically MAGA, is Trump 2.0. Milei had to beg a bailout, already needs another. Argentina's economy is in a tailspin. Government bonds and peso in freefall. People are starving and throwing rocks at him. And Farage said last year, he's amazing. It's Thatcherism on steroids. Cutting and slashing, that's leadership. Right, look at Javier Milei and what he's doing to the government. That is what Nigel Farage will do to the UK.
Argentina's fascinating. And I think the man with the chainsaw, the funny hairstyle. I mean, look, what he is doing is amazing, and I'd love to sit here with you in 2 years' time. We both say, "Wow,
yeah,
this worked." He is amazing, and I mean, this is like Thatcherism on steroids. I mean, this is incredible. cutting or slashing public expenditure, doing all the things that he's done. I tell you what, that's leadership. Argentina's.
Do you understand why I don't like Nigel Farage? Just looking at his face there, I don't like Nigel Farage whatsoever. Which brings me to something else. I posted this on my channel earlier today. Spitting Image, which is a famous UK puppet satirical comedy, has been resurrected. This was big in the 80s and early 90s. In fact, I have this classic Spitting Image 7-inch vinyl. Still, I have this. The Chicken Song, which is famous, and I've Never Met a Nice South African, which is ever more apt. Sorry to decent South Africans out there, but it's really funny. Obviously, this was the time of apartheid and whatnot. And anyway, so Spitting Image, there's my connection to Spitting Image. They are an amazing, or used to be this amazing puppet satirical comedy that was very highbrow. I mean, the new iteration is so on point. This is a masterful video, but it's way more caustic than it used to be, more sweary, and sometimes very, very inappropriate. But I tell you what, that 13-minute video is freaking diamond, and it deals with things that are highly controversial, like Charlie Kirk's killing, and it takes no prisoners, by the way. The way it deals with Charlie Kirk's killing there, I was not expecting it to go to the places it went. It deals with Trump just really, really well. It deals with Nigel Farage and the march in London. Instead of London Fashion Week, they call it London Fascist Week. Anyway, it's just absolutely brilliant. It is brilliant, but it's pretty caustic, so beware. Anyway, so where were we? So back to the US. So you got Nigel Farage, and you've got Trump's MAGA supporting Javier Milei and saying how wonderful he is ideologically and in terms of the economy and political ideology, and yet it's failed. It has failed in Argentina. So, right, I talked to you about this the other day, saying it was absolutely heinous. So Trump, through Russell Vought, the Heritage Foundation, one of the authors of Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, are now taking away $8 billion of funding for 16 different states who are democratic states. And that they've also frozen $18 billion of funding for New York City infrastructure projects to ensure funding is not flowing based on unconstitutional DEI principles. So for DEI, they are taking away funding from building like tunnels and whatnot in New York, metro tunnels and stuff. Like, how is this legal? Some says it's not legal. So what the US is doing is illegal. This should all go through Congress, and he's just deciding this unilaterally. This is absolutely incredible. I detailed this on a previous video of how it is illegal and arguably unconstitutional as well. Incredibly problematic, that, incredibly. And then you get this. So Hill Republicans estimate Trump will need to send as much as $50 billion into farmers hit by the tariffs. And again, this doesn't appear to be coming from Congress. This is coming unilaterally from Trump saying, I'm going to give a bailout to farmers who are hurt because I put tariffs on. And I'm going to use the tariff money. Like, I've lit a fire and I'm going to put the fire out. Look at me, how amazing I am. Oh, I'm the arsonist. So he will need to send as much as $50 billion to bail out the farmers hit by his tariffs. The Trump administration plans to roll out billions from the USDA, but Treasury officials and others are eyeing ways to tap the tariff revenue without a fight in Congress. So we'll see if Congress have anything to do with this or not. As Sarah Longwell says, so Americans get to pay higher prices because of the tariffs and then have their tax dollars used to bail out farmers who are being hurt by the tariffs. Cool. Remember, tariffs are a tax on the consumer. So they're paying more, and they're paying more, ruining farmers in the process of having to pay more for their goods. Farmers get screwed, so it's a double whammy, and then the money they're paying more for is being paid to the farmers for compensation for being screwed over by the tariffs that were put on in the first place. It's just insane. Right, what else is going crazy? Black Hawk helicopters, literally, Black Hawk helicopters are flying in, I think this is in Chicago, and people were rappelling down the building as part of ICE. This is what ICE were doing. ICE rappelled from Black Hawk helicopters and detain US citizens. They grab everyone from an apartment complex, even zip tie the children together. Quote, they had the black people in one van, the immigrants in another van. One witness said, one agent literally laughed. He said, F them kids. Trucks and military-style vans were used to separate the children from their parents, destroying neighbourhood property in the process. Quote, my building was shaking. Then I looked out the window and it's a Black Hawk helicopter, said another witness. We're under siege. We're being invaded by our own military. ICE released statements saying the raid went smoothly and was targeted to find gang members in the apartment complex on the south side of Chicago. So I don't know why ICE members are looking for gang members. And anyway, this is a militarization of American society, and this goes back to the fascism video I did the other day. They're using freaking Black Hawk helicopters to land people on buildings. Absolutely insane. What else is nuts? In this raid, they dragged naked children out of their homes and put them into U-Haul vans, and now they're bragging about it. US citizens had their doors smashed down and were forced into handcuffs and held outside for hours. Senior citizens held outside, their homes trashed. As Crystal Ball says, she's married to Karl Kozlinski. This has to be criminal. Doing this to kids is beyond evil. And, you know, you can go and read some more there on the details of that staggering outcome. Now, there's been a government shutdown, and this has been an excuse, I think, because they're trying to blame Democrats and trying to say that the hold-up is because Democrats want to pay Medicare and Medicaid money to illegal immigrants, Medicaid money. And Democrats are like, no, we're not. And your own government website says that can't happen. And it's not, you know, that is literally impossible to happen. And it's not true. But the Republicans are lying about that. And Trump has lied about it. He's been called out several times. He was asked a question about that in the White House and he didn't answer the question. Others have been called out on it. It is not true. So they keep lying. And then they've closed down the government, and this is their excuse to get rid of maybe 100,000 civil service employees, which they're going to get rid of based on their political orientation, which is what I talked about in the last video, and that's been admitted by Trump and others. Trump admitted that he wasn't going to negotiate previously anyway. He said so on Fox and Friends about 3 weeks ago. So this is like, how they can blame the Democrats is beyond me, but they do. Now the Democrats are in this position where like they need to hold their ground, so it's going to be a real game of chicken. And it's not going to take many Democrats to cross the aisle to vote with the Republicans for that to change. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. At the moment, people according to polls, are blaming the Republicans more than Democrats, and I would say rightly so. But this is fascinating one there. Now these are TSA employees, so the people that work on in airports checking in people and whatnot. This is LaGuardia Airport, which seems to have come to a standstill. So there you go. Just a poll I thought was interesting on freedom of speech. Because I know I've been arguing with someone about freedom of speech who seems to think Donald Trump is the best on freedom of speech ever. And yet, actually, when you ask the general public, which party do you think poses a bigger threat to freedom of speech? Republican Party, 40%, Democrats, 28%, both equally 22%, not sure 10%. So essentially 40% to 28% Republican to Democrat. So, yeah, most people seem to think Republicans are now attacking freedom of speech. Remember when it was called Trump derangement syndrome, TDS, if you claimed that Trump would? So I've been in this situation where I'm saying, watch out, Trump's going to do this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Oh, you got TDS. Oh, you got TDS. It's like, okay, all this has happened now. Is that TDS? No, it's not. That's reality. So who was more accurate, me or you denying it? So here's a nice list. Remember when it was called DDS, if you claimed that Trump would deploy troops to cities, implement Project 2025, which he denied knowing anything about, then seemed to imply that all hail Russell Vaughan, the famous from Project 2025. You told us you knew nothing about that. Okay. So pardon January the 6th insurrectionists, politicise the DOJ for revenge, ruin trade policy with tariffs, start wars, not achieve peace in Ukraine, be worse for Gaza, give preferential access to the wealthy, appoint underqualified loyalists, and break his promises on tech and finance policy. And yet, here we are. And the idea that the media has a left-wing liberal bias is nonsense. They spend this last election cycle vilifying Harris's claims about Trump, and yet they've all come true. Harris repeats claim that Project 2025 is Trump's plan. That's still not right. And of course, you can call it Trump's plan or you can call it the people behind him, but it's Trump's administration. It is their plan, and it is being carried out. And it's being carried out at an incredible clip. And finally, for this section, what is worthy of note is that actually Trump's polling is very bad. So actually, it's not that popular what he's doing. But he's still doing it. So you can ask, well, so what? No need to be scared of him. The trend is clear. Everyone outside of his hard base is abandoning him. Greg Sargent says, oof, in a new Quinnipiac poll, Trump's approval is down to 43.54 in Pennsylvania. Now, what's important about this poll, and it's interesting, this is the Pennsylvania poll. I hadn't actually read this. I just vaguely saw a poll here that I knew would be interesting to talk about. This Quinnipiac poll, they were very accurate. They do good polling in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, Trump won by 2% in the 2024 election, and they nailed it on at 2%. So the Quinnipiac, I'm not sure it's overall the most accurate pollster. I mean, it's pretty good at certain times and certain places and certain contexts. But in Pennsylvania, it's very good. So actually, this should be taken pretty seriously. So among independents in Pennsylvania, it's 29-64. And indeed, Josh Shapiro is now plus 16 in Pennsylvania. And Josh Shapiro as a governor there, that is in a state where Trump won, and now you've got something like 1 in 3 Republican voters supporting Josh Shapiro. So it should give you a kind of idea, like that could be a bit of a barometer for actually Trump isn't that popular among the electorate at the moment. And as more and more people find out what's going on, if the government shutdown ends up costing people, prima facie in like lost jobs and so on and so forth. But actually, it's all a big fight over Medicaid and Medicare. Some people are saying, that was what I meant to talk about. Some people are saying the Democrats should not try and negotiate with the Republicans and allow them to pass through everything they want to pass through to keep the government open. And the reason people are saying this is because the problem is the Democrats don't want the general population of America to hurt, right? So they're actually doing what they think is the best for the population. Because if what the Republicans want goes through, then people's insurance premiums that they will have to pay if they're on Medicaid will go up ×2 or ×3. And there are many people saying, actually, if the Democrats weren't arguing over that, then that would happen and people would realise, it'd be very painful, and that's what the Democrats don't want. They don't want people's insurance premiums to go up ×2, ×3. Because people are going to go bankrupt due to chemotherapy, right? But if people recognise that, because apparently those new enrollments in Medicaid and Medicare are higher in red states, right? So this is one of the things where the Republicans are trying to screw over Medicaid and Medicare, but actually it's going to hurt disproportionately red state voters more than blue state voters and red voters like Republicans. And so there are some saying that, let it happen. They will then go, oh my God, we've been screwed over by a government. And then midterms come along and the government get absolutely punished for it. But anyway, I digress. The point is that actually Trump's not doing very well in polls at the moment. I was going to do some stuff on the UK, but you probably heard enough from me now. One thing I will say is, oh dear, Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party seem to be now going down the right-wing populist route. And they're going like MAGA, just like Reform. So former Tory Prime Minister Theresa May has said, okay, what's the news? Kemi Badenoch, who is a leader of the Conservative Party now has vowed to repeal Climate Change Act if the Tories win the next election, dismantling what's been a cornerstone of green policy for successive governments. And not only that, to bring themselves out of the European Court of Human Rights. So we want to get rid of human rights and we want to get rid of climate change. And we're going to start going down the anti-science, populist, right-wing populist side of things where we're going to deny climate change. Now, you might ask why she suddenly decided that. Kemi Badenoch, it turns out she's just received £7 million worth of funding for the Conservative Party from climate science denial groups. Anyway, that aside, the former Prime Minister Theresa May, who was like a sensible Conservative, said, quote, while the consensus is being tested, the science remains the same. We owe it to our children and grandchildren to ensure we protect the planet for the futures, and that means giving business the reassurance it needs to find the solutions for the very grave challenges we face. So at the moment, like big business wants to make super loads of money, and it doesn't matter if the climate gets destroyed. So they'll fund climate science denial so they can keep making big money. And you get wingnut people who will deny it. And I'm sure I get people commenting on the threads, but do you know what? Go and argue with a scientist. Broadly speaking, you're wrong. And I'm justified in scientific consensus. Anyway, the fact that the Conservative Party is going down this route is a properly depressing thing. And the state of political conversation on things like this, and you can see it in the US with not just climate science denial, but also with regard to just science funding in general, and the head of HHS in the US being RFK Jr., who's just a wingnut, so on and so forth. It's pretty depressing. And the final thing I'll say, Tommy Robinson's Unite the Kingdom rally that just took place in London was sponsored by a convicted fraudster allegedly behind cryptocurrency rug pulls. Far-right rally was bankrolled by convicted fraudster alleged to be behind 2 cryptocurrency scams, according to a Byline Times investigation. So, yeah, typical. There you go. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.